Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and joining me this week we have Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist Luke Gittos.
Hi.
So plenty to talk about today. We'll be discussing week one of the Starmer regime, Joe Biden's leadership challenges, and the huge electoral upset in France. About a week ago, we had the UK general election, massive landslide for Keir Starmer, as everyone I'm sure is aware by now. There's been a lot of talk about how a certain amount of calm and peace and stability has descended on the country. So much so, in fact, that Lisa Nandy, Starmer's culture secretary, has been able to declare an end to the culture war. So what have you made of that?
Now, that was an interesting intervention. So when she went to DCMS, to the culture department, she spoke to staff and said the era of culture wars are over. That's very much been the kind of narrative, I suppose, in the media more broadly, was that we've gone through this period of crazy Tories inventing these issues out of whole cloth so as to, you know, excite the Daily Mail and to distract from their otherwise failures. So it very much played into that. But it was such an odd thing for certainly Lisa Nandy to say, given the fact that she was a pretty unrepentant culture warrior on certainly the gender issue. She even said to a gender critical campaigner at one point blank that she would happily put a child rapist in a women's prison.
Yeah.
And this is the person saying, oh, now that crazy time is over. So it's a sign, I think, of the extent to which they're kind of riding high, the arrogance that was already set in, that despite the quite weak mandate that we talked about on the show last week, they're very much back in the driving seat. And so they can be hypocrites. They can kind of say things like the culture wars are over whilst continuing to pursue 2 or 3 or 4 of their own. Because I think they very much are kind of riding high at this point and feel that they can kind of, you know, make these ridiculous statements.
Yeah, and certainly the media are fluffing them up a great deal. I don't know, I've been enjoying, there's been about 3 or 4 different columns saying how sexy Keir Starmer is. Caitlin Moran declared herself aroused by the new Prime Minister. Someone described him as daddy in the Metro. But generally there is, you know, the media are almost to some extent putting their feet up a little bit. They think they don't have to scrutinise this stuff because it's full of such sensible and wise and brilliant people.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most quoted sayings is the adults being back in the room.
Yeah.
And of course, as we've learned through recent years, the adults are often responsible, the supposed adults are sometimes responsible for the biggest screw-ups in our political history. But look, on Starmer and the culture war, I mean, I remember him as a director of public prosecutions. So I used to write about him a lot and wrote about him from the perspective that he would often politicize issues within the justice system, often drawing issues in the wider culture into his role as director of public prosecutions. I think he's always had that impulse to bring cultural discussion into the role that he's doing. So it doesn't surprise me that he has this impulse towards engaging in the culture war, which I think has been tempered. You know, we've seen this. It was very clear in the election campaign that part of his ticket was to say that he would end the culture war.
Yeah.
And I think we covered that at the time. And, you know, recent interviews with Tony Blair indicating that he'd advised Starmer to step back from any of these big discussions and make
Steer clear of woke.
And to take a reasonable line on these culture war issues. But what I think that is translating to in the context of Starmer is that we shouldn't be allowed to talk about these things, and we shouldn't be allowed to debate them, and we shouldn't have a view on them. You know, this was the man who said that 99.9% of women don't have a penis.
Yeah.
Which, like it or not, is taking a view on a culture war issue. It is saying that 0.01% of women do have a penis. And there are other examples where, you know, he is very openly, you know, he was one of the first leading politicians to take the knee during the course of the BLM movement, in that awful, cringeworthy photo with him and Angela Rayner. So he is someone who dips into the culture wars when it suits him, and then wants to shut down any discussion of them as part of his political program.
In a weird sort of way, I think that whole the culture wars are over thing is a way of saying we've won. Like, we're back in power. And yes, that's incredibly anti-democratic, but that's the nature of the culture war in general, isn't it? Is that it's always been something that's been kind of imposed from on high, often by institutions or governments that are either not letting on what they're doing or pretending that they're not doing it. So it's kind of back to business as usual in a strange sort of way. You know, previously you just had the Tory party kind of limply resisting this stuff.
Yeah.
Now it will just continue on the course that the elites always wanted it to, I suppose.
And another way in which things feel like they're back to business as usual has been some of the appointments to the cabinet. You know, taking people or putting people in the House of Lords, so-called experts, whether that's Patrick Vallance, who people remember from lockdown fame. That's why we have no money here, by the way, in case you're wondering why are we spending as much on debt interest as we are on defence or education, is because of what Patrick Vallance was advising the country to do. But anyway, he's seen as this sort of expert. James Timpson from Timpson's is now suddenly being elevated to this position of being in charge of the sort of prisons. So there is, again, this, they're portraying themselves as experts, as adults, as serious, sensible policy people, and you daren't argue with that. That's sort of the tone that it's taken.
Well, I wonder where these appointments end up. So taking James Timpson, for example, one of the major policy announcements this week, or purportedly major policy announcements, has been to do with prisons and saying that the prisons are full. I think there's only 750 places across the country at the moment or something ridiculous, and that number needs to come down. The policy announcement was effectively a new version of what the Tories had already introduced. So releasing some criminals after 40% of their sentence, whereas now they're entitled to be released after 50%. The Tories already had a sentencing bill progressing through Parliament, which looked very similar to this. It was on its third reading or so. So this is a repackaged version of what was already happening under the previous government. And I do wonder what happens when Timpson... When Timpson says something that maybe Starmer doesn't agree with, who comes out on top on these issues of policy? Because Timpson is someone who's obviously geared towards rehabilitation as a priority. He's someone who believes in using prison as a way of bringing people back into society, which is all very well. By the way, we do a lot of that already, and it certainly doesn't deal with the overcrowding issue. But I wonder where these appointments end up, where they match with politics, because James Timpson might have certain views on how things should be done. But what happens when he says, I want to do X, and Keir Starmer wants to do Y?
Yeah, and Vallance is already openly bashing Brexit, saying, we need to bring back free movement and stuff like that, which is an odd position to take if you're, posing as apolitical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you're already starting to see those kind of frictions, because these aren't necessarily political animals. These are not people who've come through your party structure in quite the same way. So that's going to store up problems for him. I think kind of Keir Starmer's technocratic nature, his desire to get the experts or the adults or whoever we're calling them in the room, could come back to bite him, because there is this thing called politics. You have to keep the public on side. You have to keep your own party on side. You have to make sure people are more or less on message. That becomes a lot more difficult to do when you outsource everything. And also when you empower the civil service to the extent that seems to be taking place. I mean, we've seen leading civil servants, Matthew Rycroft posing for social media snaps with the new Home Secretary, talking about their partnership. And also going into this government, the extent to which Sue Gray, famously of the Partygate sort of kangaroo court, essentially making clear that this was going to be a Labour government that was very much in tune with the civil service. That sounds great if you want to sort of deliver things, as they constantly talk about. But the civil service is terrible at delivering things, and also can have a bit of a mind of its own, shall we say, at certain points. And I don't, even though the two sides are much more aligned, shall we say, than they were previously. Reportedly, they had to encourage civil servants not to clap too aggressively when they welcome their new ministers, something in the Mail on Sunday. That's still going to be a problem for them that even previous Labour governments have come up against.
Definitely. And what have you both made of the sort of priorities? I mean, you've mentioned the prisons thing. That's understandable because we know there's a looming crisis. So there's obviously going to be an announcement on that. It's been a lot of fuss about housing. But equally, today, the day we're recording this, Ed Miliband has declared, his ban on new oil and gas explorations to come in straight away, immediately. That seems like a very, very warped priority, essentially choking off the UK's energy supply before you've basically got your feet under the desk.
I suppose it raises the question of how bold they can be on such a fragile mandate, because they are going to... So another immediate announcement was scrapping Rwanda. I think they're going to be pushed on the detail of their own plans for dealing with illegal migration. We've had this... Border Force announcement about giving new powers to effectively police officers to deal with the issue, creating more Europe-wide cooperation to deal with organised crime. I mean, I'm very sceptical about the prospects of that for success, primarily because the National Crime Agency is already very, very active in trying to deal with this.
Yeah.
They have enormous powers. I mean, the anti-terror criminal law that we have and the criminal law that could be applied here is very, very broad already. So unless there is something radically new that he can do with the criminal law, I don't see how that is going to assist him. And I think his response to the illegal migration speaks to this technocratic nature that he has. He's a lawyer. He sees the law as something he can use to fix a problem. But he's going to have to figure out a way to win back those roughly 4 million reform voters. He's doing, because those are nonetheless his mandate depends on maintaining at least or attempting to win over people who are concerned about these issues.
And you cannot ignore the electorate forever, particularly on this thin mandate, as you say. I mean, you could see an argument if they were saying, right, we're going to just focus on delivery, and therefore we're going to get the public on side. They'll start to see noticeable changes. But what is it that they want to deliver? It's making energy more expensive, as you suggest. I mean, I thought it was fascinating that when Rachel Reeves, the new Chancellor, makes a big speech about how, Britain's open for business and we're going to do all this reform and starting with the planning system. The thing that she singles out is we've lifted the ban on onshore wind.
Yeah.
As if that will make any difference whatsoever. I mean, it shows that to the extent they are going to deliver things, to the extent they are going to be relatively radical, it's in the worst possible way.
Yeah.
And in a situation where Reformer came second in something like 87, 89 seats, it's going to come back to bite them quite quickly. They can't carry on like it's 1997 in 2024. The world has changed, the electorate has changed, and they've come to really dislike certain aspects of the Labour Party, which are now coming to the surface after this election.
Yeah, definitely. We should talk a little bit about the Tories. Already they're starting to fight like rats in a sack, which is probably to be expected after their colossal defeat. Most significantly, Suella made quite a stark intervention in the US at the National Conservatism Conference. I mean, she didn't say anything that you necessarily disagree with, particularly on the trans issue, which is where she's drawn the most flack. She said, the Progress Pride flag represents a dangerous ideology. And she said that, children were essentially being mutilated by the NHS on the Conservatives' watch. Why has that upset people so much?
Well, I think we're seeing the playing out of the Tory melodrama that we've seen for the last 11, 12, 18 months, really. I mean, over the discussions around Rwanda, you saw this cleavage within the party between the right and the centrists. And I think generally that's now translated into, you had these leaked cabinet discussions over the weekend, in which Kemi Badenoch effectively was accused by Suella Braverman of effectively sleepwalking into a defeat for the Conservatives. And so now you're going to see this opening up a little bit more. And effectively, on the one side of the party, you have Suella Braverman saying, bringing the culture war issues to a far greater focus and taking very strong stances on these particular issues. But I think there is a big chunk of the Conservative Party who see their pathway back to power as selecting someone slightly more moderate, people like Robert Jenrick, people like that. But this discussion has been around and been playing out for a long time now.
Yeah.
And they've been sniping at each other for a long time, particularly around the legality of their plans relating to Rwanda. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that as the leadership contest probably heats up towards the end of this year.
Yeah, definitely. It does seem sort of fanciful that the sort of wet wing of the Tory party can claim victory after this. After all those people go to reform, actually sensible centrism is the answer.
It's never stopped them before. I mean, there's nothing... the centrist capacity for self-delusion is incredible.
Yeah.
I think we may well see that play out here. I think it would be absurd if, you had a kind of a centrist kind of wet Tory, One Nation, whatever you want to call them, figure emerge from the ashes of this particular election, for all the reasons that you've just said. At the same time, I think it's interesting how something like the Suella Braverman scandal has sort of demonstrated that people from that side of the party, whether it's within the party or in the kind of commentariat, still don't really get a lot of these underlying issues. Yeah. I get that some people didn't take kindly to her language talking about the mutilation of children in the NHS, but if you're more upset by how she expressed it than the scandal itself, then I think your moral compass is screwed up, and you are more concerned with just looking good on the BBC than you are with actually dealing with the issues that people are now increasingly, even with this defeat, will look more to the Tory party than the Labour Party to deal with. It's an area where they could start to rebuild, but there are still many people within and certainly around the Tory party who seem to be convinced that they've got to ignore this stuff, or certainly just not talk about it too intemperately.
A few decades ago, having a private life was incredibly easy. But now that we're all online, keeping your personal data safe is harder than ever. Big data trackers and even just nosy people are constantly trying to keep track of your digital habits. But you can stop them with ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN helps you reclaim your privacy by completely hiding your IP address. This stops any third party from following your online activity. It also encrypts all of your online traffic, even when using public Wi-Fi. With minimal effort, ExpressVPN will help you basically become anonymous on the internet. The best part about ExpressVPN is that it's incredibly easy to use. All I had to do was download the app, tap one button, and I was all set. Whether I'm writing, researching, relaxing, or travelling, ExpressVPN quietly protects my privacy in the background. It also works on all devices, including phones, laptops, and TVs. Speaking as a journalist, ExpressVPN's simple reliability has been a godsend. So, protect your online privacy today by visiting expressvpn.com/spiked. That's expressvpn.com/spiked, and you can get an extra 3 months for free. That's expressvpn.com/spiked.
So let's move on. Let's discuss Joe Biden, who is facing a very serious leadership crisis. The pressure on him to step down is increasing every day, not just from major figures in the Democratic Party, but also George Clooney, who is one of his major donors, or at least organises a lot of his fundraising, has said it's time to go, Joe. Obviously, this stems from his absolutely dreadful performance at the debate a few weeks ago, where basically what was obvious to everyone, that he's a little bit doddery, that maybe he's a little bit past it, became suddenly undeniable. People had tried to, his sort of fluffers in the media had tried to pretend there was no issue, just a right-wing talking point. Now it's there. We can't hide from it anymore.
I think it's a lot of Americans. I think a new poll suggests about 2/3 of them now think that Biden should drop out. I think a lot of them are justifiably extremely angry, thinking about how this could have possibly happened, that you get this late in an election race and effectively forced to change candidates. We're recording this on the day that Biden is due to give a press conference, much touted press conference at NATO, and this is being talked about as a big test of his cognitive abilities. But when you are seriously talking about a presidential candidate on the basis, well, can he make it through this press conference?
Yeah, not can he do well, but can he actually
can he survive? It's obviously most Americans think this is a disastrous situation to be in. The question is what happens next, because I think this is historically would be close to unprecedented for a new candidate to step in. It looks like we could end up with Kamala Harris sworn in as president. And I think largely that reflects the fact that they raised money for Harris and Biden, so they can use that money for a Harris ticket. But obviously Harris has performed very, very poorly when it comes to the American public and polling, etc. And so I think most Democrats are terrified. I think most Americans are confused, angry. And we will potentially, over the next couple of weeks, see a historical American moment where someone... they're forced very late in the day to make very dramatic changes.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting with the Harris being the alternative, the vice president. It's as if the Democratic elite foisted two dud candidates on the public, not just one. Because sometimes, to be quite frank, she can sound as incoherent as old Joe sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. It's like superficially coherent, but actually doesn't make any... It's like a kind of malfunctioning talking Hallmark card, It's like, she works making those kind of motivational posters for offices. Yeah, it's really, really strange.
In the context of your being, that kind of thing. You sound like you just fell out of a coconut tree. Be unbound by what was bound, or I can't even
be unbound by what was before. I can't remember. That's whatever line that is. It's a favourite of hers.
That was probably whatever we said was probably more coherent,
or at least strikingly similar.
Yeah,
I mean that was always the strange thing about the Harris pick. Was because of the fact that she barreled out of the primary last time around pretty early on, not least because she really struggled amongst African-American voters, where Biden was really strong. It actually saved his first primary campaign, was the South Carolina primary, where he was endorsed very heavily by leading black Democrats there and so on. And then they kind of put her on the ticket almost as like, this is to show the diversity of the coalition, whatever, it would be good for black voters. They were already much more in favour of Joe Biden than they ever were in favour of her. Yeah. So it's just a sign that kind of... whenever a centre-left party, and certainly the Democrats, start harping on about this identity stuff, they're probably talking about a candidate who is shit. Yeah. I mean, you had that with Hillary Clinton. That was her only play. This woman who was incredibly disliked amongst the country, seen as crooked in all kinds of different ways. So you just have to go with the gender issue. Wouldn't it be brilliant to smash the glass ceiling? Similarly, Kamala Harris, there's nothing there apart from this kind of, slightly deranged motivational speaker. And so that's who they've kind of lumbered themselves with, if you like. And it staggers me just on the level of kind of sheer foresight and competence that they would have done that, because it was even going into the last election. I mean, Joe Biden is if you look back at clips from 2020, he's incredibly coherent in comparison to now. But even then, he was saying loads of strange things. He forgot Obama's name at one event. He called a student who was having a go at him a lying dog-faced pony soldier. He's saying really strange things on the debate stage. And so there was a sense he might not make it to a second term. Who's his VP going to be? They'll probably fill the shoe. And they picked Kamala Harris. But the capacity for kind of quite self-destructive decisions because it looks good on on an advert is really core to the Democrats these days, it seems like. I think for a lot of people also, it's not just exposed to the Democrats, but also the media, the liberal media in particular, have just it's essentially lied on Joe Biden's behalf. Consistently acted like Pravda. I mean, it's been extraordinary. I mean, they're now, in the past few weeks, they are starting to do some holding him to account. But what were they doing before?
Well, not much. I mean, I think that, as I said, there would be justified confusion and anger on behalf of Americans. It's worth mentioning also that Trump is now in a position where his legal woes look to be largely resolved. He's coming off the back of his Supreme Court victory, which effectively gave him partial immunity for a lot of the offence that he was charged with. And he's now going to be able to use that narrative when going into the subsequent campaign. So he's riding high and strong. And I think he probably, there was the leaked video of him talking on a golf buggy about the prospect of entering into a contest against Kamala Harris. And he looks to be relishing it because I think she will be... for all the reasons you suggest, she shares some of the competency issues that Biden has. I think Trump is proving a lot more popular among ethnic minority voters and improving his position in that regard. So I think he's game for the fight, and I think he'll enjoy fighting Harris rather than Biden.
Definitely. And Tom, anything you want to add?
No, I just think just on the media point, because it's been a bit of a theme with the with the Starmer conversation as well. The cravenness really is worth underlining, not just the obscuring what was obviously clear to everyone else, and then kind of feigning surprise when the world saw in that debate and it was impossible to cover it up anymore. But also things like this story, it's a small story, but I think it's kind of indicative of a broader trend where there was this radio station in Philadelphia where the radio host had admitted that she'd basically just asked Biden the questions that had been given to her by the White House. She eventually had to step down, all the rest of it. But at the same time, I thought that was telling, because even though that was the most egregious version of client journalism that we might have seen, is it a million miles away from the New York Times pretending, or any of these outlets essentially just kind of pretending or certainly downplaying what was playing out before Americans' eyes these past couple of years? Yeah, and it's been fascinating. I mean, it's also blunted one of their key attack lines, which is that Trump is an existential threat to democracy. And thinking, if you don't get rid of Biden, who you know is a no-hoper, do you really believe that this threat exists if you're prepared to take that enormous risk of putting a no-hoper candidate up against it? So it'd be interesting to see what happens. So the French parliamentary elections have delivered an extraordinary upset. I don't think anyone would have expected last week that the left-wing New Popular Front would come out on top. No party got an overall majority, so no party is even close to getting anywhere near a majority. Second came Emmanuel Macron's Ensemble, and then third we had the National Rally, even though they got the highest share of the vote on 37%. Tom, what have you made of this? I mean, this, I think, is this possibly the last gasp for the cordon sanitaire? Because it seems to be the result mostly of tactical voting, negative voting, anyone but Le Pen. Yeah, because in a sense, it's another victory for what they refer in France to the Republican Front that would kick in whenever Le Pen essentially was vying previously for the presidency, but now legislatively as well. And that's exactly what happens. That's the reason you got such a drastically different result from the first round to the second, because you had coordination between the centrist bloc and the left-wing bloc pulling candidates where the other one didn't have a chance, therefore not splitting the kind of anti-RN votes. And it's delivered this result. So in a sense, it's, another victory for the Republican Front, if you like. Yeah. But again, if you look under the surface, that's really not the whole story, is it? Not least because of the fact this was still RN's best election result ever. Yeah. I mean, when Emmanuel Macron came to power in 2017, and in the legislative elections that followed, they had 8 seats. Yeah. They're now on something like 143. And given Macron's whole pitch, aside from I'm going to modernise France and make us a start-up nation and all the kind of usual sort of centrist lorem ipsum that tends to figure in these people's kind of programmes, it was very much I am the one who's kept out the far right.
Yeah.
And yet, under his tenure, you've seen not just the sort of polls for the for Rassemblement National, but also in actual elections, in terms of seats, grow and grow and grow and grow. And I've always been struck by the remarkable complacency of the sort of centrist elites in general when it comes to populism. Is that as soon as there's one defeat, even if it's narrower than last time, they're like, "Oh, that's over now."
Yeah.
Fantastic. It's incredible that they will just willfully ignore the kind of longer term trend, which is that there are an awful lot of people in France, particularly working class voters, who are not flocking towards the New Popular Front. They are flocking towards Le Pen's party. Really want to hit out of the establishment, and they're furious about various issues which the centrists and the left are kind of united in not really caring about.
Yeah.
Certainly when it comes to green issues, certainly when it comes to migration. And that's not going to go anywhere. And you cannot deal with this phenomenon by just ignoring it and doubling down.
Yeah.
You have to respond to those concerns that those voters have, but there's a refusal to do any of that and just to continue saying, oh, we've got away with it again. Let's see what happens next time.
And even the fact that literally every election now is about Le Pen, is about the far right, or, Rassemblement National. There's no other thing on the table. It's, can we keep them out? And that's it. I mean, it is extraordinary. You mentioned some of those issues like migration and green. And, the New Popular Front have come up with an extraordinary program to double, triple, quadruple down on some of those issues. So if you take migration, they want to basically accelerate the pace at which migrants can claim welfare. They want to fast track what they call climate refugees, which could be, that's potentially hundreds of millions.
British people don't like the rain,
Yeah, exactly. Is your coastal town being eroded? Get over to France. On green issues, they want to ban pesticides. They want to not just, phase out petrol cars by 2035, as the EU does. They want every single petrol car off the road by 2040. They want to double down on net zero. They want to have a referendum every time someone proposes a nuclear power plant. I mean, it's just absolutely crackers. And it's not just... A lot of people will talk about, they want to raise taxes and all that. They're missing the bigger picture. They are taking the issues that people care about and, just putting the finger up at them and saying, yeah, actually, you hate this. We're going to we're going to times it up to 100. And as you said, Tom, this is basically the working class versus the bourgeois elite. It's extraordinary, even though these are nominally left-wing parties that used to represent the working class. If you look at the polls, it's the wealthiest people who support them.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a divide for some time in French politics between those who live on the periphery and outside of major cities and those who live within them. And I think that divide is not going anywhere. Le Pen said that this effectively deferred victory until the presidential election. I think there's probably some truth in that. Like it or not, the right in France is the resurgent force, and I think they have Macron has been revealed to be holding on to a very, very fragile position, and that's not going anywhere.
And every vote, it gets more and more fragile. Every coalition gets more tenuous. I mean, it's worth pointing out that the New Popular Front is itself a coalition between multiple parties, that don't agree with each other on basically anything. They were fighting like rats in a sack only just a few weeks ago before the elections were called. Whereas, at least the National Rally have a coherent sense of who they are. The idea that you're going to have this coalition, then possibly joining hands with the centrists. So, it's so much compromising and horse trading that would have to go on to sustain that. It's just going to be another year or so of paralysis, and as if that's a victory for, democracy, for stability. It's just insane.
And I think the Macron reign is a bit of a warning to Keir Starmer to a certain extent as well. I know he's a slightly different political animal. We kind of emerged through the Socialist Party to a certain extent, at least certainly had some government appointments. Later to kind of form this more centrist, in quote marks, liberal party that basically laid waste to both the centre-right and the centre-left in France back in 2017. But nevertheless, I think seen as a figure, and certainly discussed as a figure who is the response to populism. He's a kind of anti-populist figure of the centre, and yet he's stuck to this playbook, which Starmer in his own way seems keen to repeat, which is the way that you respond to this upsurge to this calling into question of the authority of the governing parties and institutions is, as you say, to double down on all the things that they're upset about because it's good for them and they'll realise it eventually. It's insane. And I think what we're now seeing with Scholz in Germany, really basically leading a zombie government at this point. Trudeau looks very likely to be on the way out. You've got Biden, as we've just been talking about, not looking good there.
Yeah. The SNP have had an amazing kicking.
Yeah, absolutely. And strangely and unfortunately, Labour have been the beneficiaries of that. But nevertheless, you see a picture is that when you have this kind of, all of these parties, one thing they do share, even if they've got slightly different traditions, is a devotion to this new woke, green, authoritarian sort of suite of policies, which they seem keen to impose on a restive population and insisting that they'll feel the benefit eventually. And they're all coming a cropper. So I think it's a reminder that playbook, deranged as it is one a lot of politicians, including Keir Starmer, are sticking to, even in the face of all the poor results it's producing for people.
So Lucy Letby was retried, or had one retrial last week. She was found guilty again of the 7th attempted murder. Her life sentence has been reaffirmed. But despite all that, Luke, there's been a kind of growing movement saying that actually she's innocent. And it's not just on the sort of fringes of the internet. You're starting to see The Guardian, The Telegraph asking questions about this verdict. It started really with The New Yorker, which we weren't allowed to talk about because of our contempt of court laws, because that came out in the middle of her retrial. But what have you made of this? I mean, surely she's guilty. I mean,
yeah, she's guilty. I would say this. I mean, I professionally look into criminal convictions. I appeal criminal convictions and look into the evidence that was used to convict people. And what I think has been striking has been the speed at which people are willing to reject the finding of a jury. So a jury sat and listened to months and months and months of very, very complicated medical evidence about what took place at the County of Chester Hospital. The first jury were very, very considered in their verdict, rejecting some counts, and accepting others. There was a retrial in which she was convicted again. And I think people are making a very serious mistake in thinking this was a case that was all about statistics. It wasn't. It was a case about circumstantial evidence. And circumstantial evidence effectively means that there is a patchwork of circumstances that point to a particular person's guilt. There was no direct evidence of what Lucy Letby had done, but that's not surprising given what was alleged. And there is some really key central points about the evidence against her, which is often glossed over. So, for example, there was uncontested evidence during the trial that babies were poisoned with insulin by someone on that ward. Now, you can bet your bottom dollar that the lawyers defending Letby would have investigated the possibility of any other occurrence, that this was something innocent, this was something accidental, this was something negligent. They would have approached everyone that they possibly could, but still had to accept that babies were poisoned with insulin. Now, it might be the case that in years to come, that the evidence used to establish that fact that babies were poisoned with insulin on that hospital might be overturned, and we'd have to look at the case again. But the fact is that there was very, very strong evidence that someone was doing harm to babies on that ward. And then you take a step back and look at the other patchwork of evidence that was against Letby for, looking at the statistics, which, although are limited in their probative value, do give some indication as to what was going on. And then the evidence about the hiding notes in her room, medical records on behalf of the children, searching the families of the children that she'd harmed on Facebook, writing handwritten notes about, saying, I'm evil, I did this. All of this is a patchwork.
Yeah.
And what I think people should do is, rather than read those Guardian articles or the Telegraph article, go and read the far longer Court of Appeal decision which rejected her application for leave, because they go through all the evidence on every single one of the counts, and it's 40 pages long or so. If you can go through that line by line and say that this is clearly mistaken for some reason, then maybe you have a point. But I think the reason it was troubling is that there is sensible questioning about criminal convictions. There are reasonable questions that you should ask, and people should always remain open to the possibility that something has gone wrong. But what I think we've seen with Lucy Letby is an unhelpful and corrosive skepticism of our processes of justice. And that's not helpful, because we're actually just distrusting what the jury found. We're assuming that the jury were too stupid to figure it out. And I think that's a big mistake.
And may I ask as well, because I'm slightly unaware of all the arguments, shall we say, on this, on the kind of Letby skeptic part of social media and journalism. But what is their claim then of what actually took place? Is it there's another killer, or is it that this is negligence being covered up? Because it's a bit hard to tell, not least when you've got loads of people pontificating at once, I suppose. But if there was a thread that seems to,
I think the theory is that this was negligence that is being blamed on someone. One reason why that makes absolutely no sense is that it's equally as negligent for the County of Chester Hospital to have housed a serial killer than it is to have let these babies die. So why would you invent a serial killer amongst your own midst in order to make yourself look better? It certainly doesn't. And
that seems to be part of the claim, at least in some of those pieces, that was it the New York piece, the NHS is like a national religion, therefore they're going to want to cover it up. Is it better that you had a serial killer on the rampage?
Yeah, and we would all tolerate the cover up, right? We would all just say, well, of course, well, the NHS can do no wrong, therefore it must have been the killer.
Yeah, exactly. And I just think it goes to that unpleasant skepticism that takes reasonable inquiry and reasonable doubt into quite a dark place.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.